Every night, just before the tide reached the broken rocks, the villagers of Greyhaven would see him, a tall, quiet man sitting at the edge of the world. No one knew his name, but everyone knew his ritual. He came when the sun bled into the horizon and left only gold fading into indigo. He stood for a while, hands in pockets, staring into the sea as if waiting for it to speak. Then he'd sit, motionless, until the last wave washed the sand from beneath his boots. Children whispered stories about him. Some said he waited for a ghost. Others said the sea had stolen someone he loved, and he was daring it to give her back. The elders simply called him the Watcher. But his name was Elias, and he had been waiting for 7 years. The night it happened was still in his bones, the sound of waves breaking like glass, the smell of rain on salt, the image of Mira laughing as she ran into the water with her lanterns. It was supposed to be a celebration, midsummer's night, when the villagers released floating lights to honor those they'd lost. Mira had always been fearless. "Let's see how far the sea can take us," she'd said. Then the storm came. He'd seen her silhouette disappear beneath the first wave, her lantern swallowed whole. He dove in, but the sea had turned monstrous, swallowing everything: sound, sight, even her name. When the storm passed, all they found was her necklace tangled in the rocks, a small silver shell that still smelled faintly of her perfume. They told him to move on. He told them he couldn't because he'd felt her hand even as the water dragged him back. Because he'd heard her voice whisper, "Wait for me." So he did. Elias built a small cottage on the cliffs, close enough to hear the tides breathing. By day, he worked repairing boats, though he rarely spoke. By night, he walked the shoreline, tracing the same path they'd once walked together, from the jagged rock she'd called the mermaid's spine to the shallow pools where she'd once collected sea glass. The villagers learned to leave him be, but sometimes they'd find his footprints in the morning, washed half away, as if the sea itself had tried to follow him. Then, one evening, something changed. The tide came in early, restless, humming like a living thing. Elias felt it before he saw it, a pulse in the air, like a heartbeat carried on the wind. The waves began to glow faintly, a pale blue shimmer spreading across the shore like spilled light. He knelt, touching the water, and the glow brightened beneath his hand. It was warm, and then he heard it, faint but real, a voice woven into the surf. "Elias." He froze. His breath caught. It was her voice. He waded in, boots sinking into wet sand, water reaching his knees. The glow intensified, spiraling outward like threads of silk under the surface. "Mira," he whispered. The sea rippled in answer. A figure began to take shape, not solid, not spirit, but something in between. Her hair floated like ink in water, her skin silvered by moonlight. "You waited," she said, her voice soft as the tide. He trembled, reaching out, his fingertips meeting nothing but cool mist. "Mira, is it really you? As much as the sea can be me." "Then come back," he said. "Stay." She smiled, sad and beautiful. "The sea doesn't give back what it keeps. But it remembers. I've always remembered you." The waves swirled around him, gentle, like hands brushing against his arms. "You shouldn't have waited," she whispered. "I promised," he said. "You told me to wait." Her laughter was like breaking light. "Then wait a little longer." The tide rose higher, her figure fading back into foam. When dawn came, the beach looked the same as it always had, only the faintest shimmer remained in the wet sand, like moonlight buried just beneath the surface. Elias sat where the waves had receded, his heart trembling with both sorrow and awe. He didn't know if he'd dreamed her, or if the sea itself had simply taken pity on him. But the silver shell around his neck was warm again. And for the first time in 7 years, he smiled. He looked toward the horizon, the endless meeting place of sea and sky, and whispered, "Then I'll wait." After that night, Elias couldn't sleep. He would lie awake, listening to the sea breathing through his open window. Every sound, every sigh of the waves against the rocks felt like a word trying to form. The villagers began to notice the change. He smiled more, spoke a little, even fixed the bell at the old chapel that had rusted silent. But when they asked if he'd finally let go, his eyes drifted toward the horizon, and he said only, "She's closer now." At dusk, he returned to the shore. The tide was unusually calm, glassy, expectant. When he stepped into the water, the glow returned instantly, coiling around his ankles like threads of silk. "Are you here?" he whispered. The waves stirred, and her voice faint, melodic rose from beneath. Always. That night, she appeared more clearly than before. Mira's form shimmered just above the tide, her body woven from liquid light. Her hair flowed like currents, her eyes twin reflections of the moon. She reached toward him, and for an instant a heartbeat he felt her touch. It was like cool fire, soft and consuming all at once. "You're stronger," he said. "The sea remembers your voice," she replied. "Every word you've spoken to it becomes part of me." He stared at her, barely breathing. "Then you've heard me all these years." Every night. Her smile was sad. "Your waiting has kept me awake beneath the waves." He reached out again, desperate. "Then come back." "I can't. The sea claimed me. It made me what I am, something that doesn't belong to the shore." She looked at him with an ache that crossed worlds. "But I can still come to you when the tide allows. Only when the moon is full, only when you still believe." He took her hands, or thought he did, and whispered, "I'll never stop." The waves brightened around them, glowing with soft silver. Above, the moon rose higher, and for a moment, it felt like the whole ocean was holding its breath. Over the next few nights, she came again. Each time the moon grew fuller, her shape became more defined. They spoke for hours about everything and nothing, about how the sea sounded different where she drifted, about how the stars looked brighter when she thought of him. He began bringing her gifts. Seashells she used to love, messages carved into driftwood, lanterns shaped like small hearts. He'd place them at the edge of the water, and by morning, they would be gone. One evening, as the horizon burned with crimson light, the waves rose higher, wrapping around his knees. When he looked down, a shell floated to the surface, a perfect spiral of silver, glowing faintly. He picked it up and held it to his ear. Inside, he heard her voice. "For when you cannot find me," it whispered, "the sea will sing for you." From then on, the sound of waves became music her voice carried through the ocean's endless song. But beauty always carries its shadow. The nights grew wilder. The sea, once gentle, began to stir with a deeper restlessness. The villagers complained of floods, of boats untied and drifting out to sea. Elias didn't care, not at first. Until one night, Mira appeared trembling, her edges flickering like light through water. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I've stayed too long," she whispered. "The sea grows jealous. It doesn't like that I remember what it feels like to love." He stepped closer, the waves lashing against his legs. "Then fight it. Stay with me." Her tears fell into the water, and the tide shimmered with every drop. "If I stay longer, the sea will take you too." "Then let it," he said. "I'd rather drown beside you than live without you." Her face broke with grief and wonder. "Don't say that. Love isn't meant to destroy what it touches." Lightning flashed far out on the horizon. The storm was coming again, the same kind that had taken her once before. Mira's form began to fade, the glow flickering like a candle in wind. "I'll find a way," she said. "Wait for me, one more time." And then she was gone. For days, the storm raged. Elias barely left the shore. Waves tore at the rocks, rain lashed the village, and wind screamed through every crack in his walls. But he refused to go inside. He stood at the cliff, soaked and trembling, shouting her name into the wind. "Mira, come back. I'm still here." No answer, only the roar of the ocean. Then, on the fifth night, the storm stopped suddenly. The sea became still, unnaturally so. A faint light began to form in the distance, rising like a ghost from the deep. Elias stepped closer, heart pounding. The glow grew brighter, pulsing with rhythm, the same heartbeat he had felt that first night. And from the calm, a whisper drifted toward him. "Elias, it's time." He knew then that the sea had made its choice. The storm broke the horizon before dawn. Greyhaven's sky turned the color of iron. The air was heavy with salt and silence, the kind that comes before something immense. Seagulls vanished inland, and the tide sank low, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. Elias knew it was coming for him. He could feel it in his bones, a pull, a calling, the same pulse that had haunted his dreams since she first spoke his name again. He walked toward the water, the wind clawing at his coat, his heart trembling between fear and hope. The beach was empty, the world hushed. And then the sea spoke. A low, resonant hum rippled through the waves, and the surface began to glow faintly at first, then blindingly bright. The light rose higher and higher until she appeared again. Mira. She was radiant, more solid, more real than ever. The ocean clung to her like a gown of living silk, her eyes shimmering with the reflection of every star that had ever shone. "You came," he said, his voice breaking. "I had to," she whispered. "The sea is changing. It wants to take you back with me to make you part of it." He stepped closer. "Then let it, if it means I'll never lose you again." She cut him off, shaking her head. "You don't understand. It won't make you you. It will drown everything you are." The first wave struck the rocks with a roar that shook the cliffs. The water rose around them, spiraling into patterns of silver and shadow. The tide hissed, pulling harder each time it retreated, as if trying to drag him under. Elias felt the sand slipping from beneath his feet. Mira reached for him, her hands glowing against the storm-dark air. "You have to go back to the village," she said. "Now." "No," he said, "not without you. Please, Elias. The sea will listen to me for only a moment longer. Don't make it take you." He shook his head, his voice rising with the wind. "You waited for me once. Now I wait for you. That's how it works." Her eyes filled with tears, droplets that sparkled like light caught in water. "You don't belong to the deep. You belong where there is morning." Lightning split the sky, a blinding arc of white that turned the sea to glass. In that frozen instant, Elias saw her pain, a love so strong it was breaking both their worlds. "If I go," he said softly, "will I see you again?" She smiled through her tears. "If you listen, if you wait, when the world is quiet enough, you'll find me in every wave." The storm unleashed itself. Rain fell in sheets, stinging like sand. The waves surged higher, clawing up the shore. The wind howled her name, twisting it into something wild and beautiful. Mira turned toward the sea, raising her arms. The water responded, curling upward, wrapping around her like living ribbons of light. "Go," she shouted, "before it takes us both." But Elias couldn't move. He stepped into the tide, fighting the pull, reaching for her silhouette through the chaos. "Elias." Her voice broke with fear and love. "I can't lose you again." He smiled, a small, quiet smile even as the sea tore at his legs. "You never did." He leapt forward. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Their hands met, her light against his skin, her warmth flooding through him like sunlight beneath the surface. Then everything exploded in white. When Elias opened his eyes, the storm was gone. He was lying on the shore, soaked and trembling. The sea stretched calm before him, shining like melted glass. Above, dawn broke gently, streaking the clouds with pink and gold. He sat up, disoriented. Mira was gone. The necklace he'd worn, her silver shell, lay on the sand beside him, cracked open. Inside was a single droplet of water, glowing softly. He lifted it to his lips without thinking, and the moment it touched him, he heard her voice. "You're safe," she whispered, close and far all at once. "You kept your promise." He closed his eyes, tears mixing with the salt wind. "Did I lose you?" he asked. "No," she said. "You found me. I'm just where I've always been, in the sea, in the sound of your waiting." The light faded, but peace filled him where grief had lived for years. He looked at the horizon and realized that, for the first time, it didn't look empty. The villagers found him later, sitting quietly on the beach. They asked if he was all right, and he simply smiled and said, "The storm gave me back what it took." They didn't understand, but that didn't matter. He rebuilt the old pier, one plank at a time, and hung lanterns along it every night. When they swayed in the wind, they shimmered faintly blue like reflections of someone walking just beneath the surface. Every evening, he returned to the same spot by the sea. He no longer waited for her to appear because he knew she was already there, in every whisper of the tide. And when the waves glowed, softly and shyly, he'd smile and say, "I know, I'm here too." The years moved quietly, like the tide retreating and returning, never still. Greyhaven changed. The fishing boats became fewer. New houses rose on the cliffs. Children grew up chasing the same gulls that once circled over Elias's lonely figure. But one thing remained constant. Every night, when the wind softened and the world grew blue, Elias walked to the shore. He carried a lantern, the same one he'd built after the storm, and hung it at the end of the pier. Its light reflected on the waves, soft and gold like a heartbeat glowing on water. The villagers still whispered about him. That's the man who talks to the sea. They say he lost someone, long ago. No, they say he found her. Elias never corrected them, he only smiled, because both were true. One evening, a small voice interrupted the wind. Mister, why do you always come here? He turned. A little girl stood barefoot on the sand, her hair wild from the breeze. She was holding a broken seashell. To talk to someone I love, Elias said gently. She frowned, squinting at the horizon. But there's no one there. Elias chuckled softly. Not where you can see. But the sea listens, you know. Every wave carries a voice if you're quiet enough. The girl tilted her head, thinking. Then she lifted the shell to her ear, listening. Her eyes widened. I hear it, it's whispering. Elias smiled. That's her. She likes when people listen. The girl grinned and ran off toward the dunes, her laughter echoing against the rocks. Elias turned back to the sea, warmth blooming in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the world opening again like the tide returning after a long absence. That night, the sea was calm, impossibly calm. The air was soft with mist, the kind that turns light into halos. Elias carried his lantern to the pier. His steps were slow now. The years had made his body fragile, but his heart was strong. The shell pendant still hung at his chest, faintly warm. He reached the edge of the pier and looked out. The horizon shimmered, faint blue light rising from the depths, curling across the surface. It looked like moonlight caught in motion. And then he heard her. Elias. Her voice was gentle, carried by the smallest wave. He closed his eyes, smiling. You came, always. The sea brightened. A shape formed just beyond the pier, faint, graceful, luminous. Mira stood there, her dress woven from water and starlight, her eyes as tender as the first dawn. You kept your promise, she said. He nodded, tears glinting in the lantern's glow. I waited, every night, and I watched, every tide. They stood there, separated by only a breath of water, two souls meeting where worlds touched. It's time, she whispered. Time, he asked softly. To rest, she said. You've given the world your waiting. Now come see what lies beyond it. Elias felt no fear, only peace. The kind that came when everything had already been said, and everything still remained. He looked at her, then at the lantern, its light flickering with the breeze. Will the sea remember me? It already does, she said, smiling. Every wave that touches this shore will carry your name. He stepped forward. The water rose to meet him, warm as a heartbeat. Mira reached out, her hands shining, her touch cool and real. The villagers would later say they saw two lights that night, one golden, one blue, merging on the horizon before fading into the dawn. But Elias didn't hear them. He only felt her hand in his, the salt on her skin, the sound of eternity in her voice. And then silence. Greyhaven never forgot the man by the sea. Fishermen began lighting lanterns on their boats at dusk. They called them Elias lights, to guide the lost home. Lovers left flowers by the pier, whispering their promises to the waves. And sometimes, when the moon was full, the water shimmered with a faint blue glow, like footsteps on the surface. Children would run to their parents, shouting, "They're dancing again, the man and the lady in the sea." And the parents would smile, watching the lights twist and fade into the waves. Because some stories never end, they just change shape. One quiet night, decades later, that same little girl, now grown, returned to the beach. She carried a child on her hip and a lantern in her hand. "Look out there," she whispered to the boy. "Do you see the glow?" The child nodded. "It's pretty." "What is it?" She smiled. "It's love. It lives here." The waves brushed the shore, gentle and rhythmic. Somewhere beneath them, the sea hummed a soft, endless sound, like a heartbeat that belonged to two souls who once waited, every night, by the sea. And for those who listened carefully enough, the tide still whispered their names. Elias, Mira, together, always.